As one of history's great atrocities and crimes, the past century has seen no shortage of artworks confronting the Holocaust and the legacy that it has left behind. One such artwork is Steve Reich's Different Trains, not only, as Richard Taruskin put it, the only adequate musical response to the Holocaust, but one of the finest examples of minimalism in music. Somewhat unsurprisingly, it's a piece that has spawned a great deal of discussion and interpretation in the 35 years since its composition in 1988. And a substantial amount of this is focused on the way in which it confronts the Holocaust through the incorporation of samples, both of actual survivor testimonies and of train sounds. This is to be expected. It's one of the most interesting and initially obvious aspects of the piece. But I find that the actual music gets left to the wayside a bit when talking about the piece. So this video, I hope, will explore the piece from both sides, examining how Steve Reich confronts crimes against humanity, both textually and musically. In the score for Different Trains, Reich provides a page-long note by the composer, explaining the background of the piece, which I'll read now. The idea for the piece comes from my childhood. When I was 1 year old, my parents separated. My mother moved to Los Angeles and my father stayed in New York. Since they arranged divided custody, I travelled back and forth by train frequently between New York and Los Angeles from 1939 to 1942, accompanied by my governess. While these trips were exciting and romantic at the time, I now look back and think that if I had been in Europe during this period, as a Jew, I would have had to ride very different trains. With this in mind, I wanted to make a piece that would accurately reflect the whole situation. But before looking in detail at the piece, it's worth examining how Reich's compositional career led him to composing a work like this. Speech melody, literally retrieving melodic material from recordings of human speech, is the fundamental basis of the melody in Different Trains. Various samples of voice recordings are heard throughout the piece. The male voices are doubled in the cellos, whilst the female voices are doubled in the violas. Different Trains was not the first time that Reich had explored speech melody, and in particular looking at some of his earlier works from the 1960s shows you how he refines the concept here in Different Trains. I'm going to take a little look at Come Out here, but if you're interested, also have a look at It's Gonna Rain. Composer Christopher Fox says of these pieces of Reich's that they take as their source material examples of utterly authentic vocal behaviour. The phrase "come out to show them" is repeated and gradually phased out of sync, before splitting, echoing, and collapsing into unintelligibility.
Come out to show them, 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 come out.
Whilst this isn't speech melody, as in transcribing speech to an instrument, it is Reich using recorded speech, and the manipulation thereof, as the starting material for a piece. Reich himself has lauded the potential of speech melody as a powerful device for introducing a kind of theatrical element to an instrumental piece. In a conversation between Reich and Stephen Sondheim, Reich says that he was recommended the work of Lajos Janáček, a Czech composer who incorporated speech melodies into his music. Reich remembers a quote of Janáček's on the topic, who says that speech melody is like a water lily on the surface, but the roots go down to the very bottom of the soul. Instrumental music is a fairly abstract thing. Obviously not that it can't communicate emotion or be reflective of things, but it's never as direct as the spoken word. Including samples in such a way does enable Reich to be far more direct with his meaning than other forms of instrumental music. But non-instrumental music and speech melody aren't the same things, so why use speech melody? Professor of music theory David Schwartz says of speech melody, "It captures in miniature the way we first hear language as pure sound, then as words, phrases, and sentences with meaning. That purity, the injecting of conversation, of ordinary speech, of memory, gives a unique emotional depth to speech melody that isn't necessarily better or more emotional than traditional melody, but it is certainly different." Before settling on using recordings from his own life combined with that of Holocaust survivor testimonies, Reich wanted to use recordings of Bartók, but was hindered by problems both legal and artistic. He then wanted to use recordings of Wittgenstein, a philosopher who Reich has engaged with deeply both in and outside of music. But the lack of recordings of Wittgenstein put an end to this idea. It was only then that survivor testimonies became the bulk of the samples. Technology too enabled Reich to use speech melody in the way he does. The Casio FZ1 and the Casio FZ10M released in 1987, just 1 year before Different Trains, and these could be loaded with samples of train whistles, bells, engines chugging along, and the speech samples. Alongside his other piece of new technology, a sequencer on a computer, Different Trains was able to include all of these samples. Reich, for a long time, maintained that the excerpt chosen was solely for their rhythmic and melodic content, rather than the meaning of the words, and only later did he concede that the language was also important. The rhythmic and melodic content undoubtedly mattered. Reich in particular highlights From Chicago to New York as a highly naturally melodic sample.
From Chicago to New York.
Amy Lynn Wlodarski argues that Reich's maintenance of the acoustic integrity of the sound clips both retained and respected the semantic meaning of the clips. Patrick Millian describes Reich's research and compositional process as something that reflects a striving towards realism and documentary aesthetics. This is how Different Trains has been viewed, as a piece of artistic documentary. Even Reich himself has perpetuated this idea, that there is no interpreting going on, but only reporting. But how true is this? Reich isn't making a documentary. He's chopping up, splicing together, or otherwise rearranging the testimonies of others to create an imagined view of the Holocaust through his artistic lens. The same as painters, writers, composers, or anyone really. I think interpreting Different Trains as a kind of archive or report does a disservice to Reich's creativity and artistry, and also somewhat to the original, unedited testimonies of the survivors that are in the piece. Testimonies of individuals, especially ones assembled into a narrative by somebody who was not there, may provide limited use to, say, a historian, but when they're chopped up, bared down upon by strings, and placed in a work like Different Trains, they inject authenticity and vulnerability, but I don't think they create reportage or documentary. The origin of Different Trains came in its form. Reich considered the idea of a piece in which sampled speech generated melodic material for strings before deciding any further what the piece would actually sound like, and it was eventually directly commissioned by Betty Freeman for the Kronos Quartet to perform. The form itself was a departure for Reich. Apart from drumming, a four-movement work composed in the early 1970s, Reich's works throughout the 70s were usually continuous, minimalist works. Christopher Fox has argued that Reich doesn't push the boat out too far with this, trying to avoid emphasis on the symmetry of the work's three movements by stitching them together closely. I don't really agree with this. I think it's extremely clear where the second movement begins once you hear it, but that stuff can just be chalked up to having different ears. Looking at the score, the first thing you notice about it is how many pages you have to flick through before you find the first note of the piece. Reich has extensive performance notes, with a full A4 page of directions and then a very detailed diagram, including this fun depiction of a sound technician. Perhaps Steve Reich is just a perfectionist generally, but for a piece which he described as autobiographical, but also one dealing with such a serious subject, no stone can be left unturned in ensuring its perfection in every performance. But looking at the actual musical score, it's immediately obvious that the speech samples come first, and the music is written to accommodate this. The tempo is at 94.2 beats per minute. This is a ludicrously specific tempo. Even very competent musicians couldn't really tell the difference between 94 and 94.2 beats per minute. When I was taught about Different Trains at school, my teacher explained to the class how it was important for the tempo to be this specific, so the string quartet would be playing exactly the same tempo as the samples. But the more I think about it, the less this explanation makes sense. The difference between a standard rounded 94 beats per minute and 94.2 beats per minute is so slight that it would take for a while for any shifting out of time to be actually detectable. This would make sense if the samples were minutes long, but they're no more than a couple of seconds, and are restarted again on beat, resetting any offset that's taken place. So why does Reich do this? Well, I'm really just speculating here, but I can think of a couple of reasons as to why. Whilst the actual tempo difference between 94 and 94.2 is negligible, Reich's own works have exploited this very kind of slight tempo difference to, over a longer period of time, create hypnotic, phase-shifted works. Reich, therefore, is highlighting through the specificity of the tempo that is not the effect that he's going for, but rather a true, unshifting harmony between speech and music. Also, the specificity of the time signature signals to the instrumental performers that they are, in essence, following the lead of the pre-recorded sample. This kind of signalling to a performer is also much more likely than a genuine practical concern, because the only decimal point tempo is this very first one. All the others are just standard whole number tempos. Or truly there may just be no reason and I'm overthinking somebody sticking a 0.2 on the end of their tempo. Though primarily a composer, Steve Reich has quite a pedigree in percussion, hence the presence of such a variety of percussion instruments in his works, and he has a number of percussion pieces in his oeuvre. This influence makes itself central to Different Trains, with the majority of the work, and virtually all of the first two movements of the piece, being based on a paradiddle, the pattern of right, left, right, left, left, or vice versa. It's not drumming though, so the pattern is realised in the strings, with the note changing instead of alternating the drumming hand. Reich chose this pattern because it pulls the trains, as he said, continuously in the first two movements. The piece opens at MF in 2/4 with one flat in the key signature. But the actual content of the harmony isn't of particular importance. It's vaguely around a D minor or G minor sound. The notes heard are D, F, G, B flat and C. But broadly speaking, the piece shifts from one harmonic space to another at the will of the samples, shifting either drastically or slightly, depending on the content of the sample.
New York to Los Angeles, New York, New York.
The whole concept of the trains is brought in right from the start of the piece, where we hear, slowly brought in, the sound of the train. But it isn't until figure 3 where the train bleeds through into the foreground of the piece, with the train whistles being heard, doubled in the strings. In his essay Music as a Gradual Process, Reich wrote that in order to facilitate detailed listening, a musical process should happen extremely gradually, comparing it to the turning of an hourglass, where ample time must elapse before all the sand has fallen through and the process is complete. Things do change across the first couple of figures of the piece. Strings slowly build in, expanding the range as the violin pulls higher and the cello falls lower. But, by and large, the music still sits in stasis until figure 6. The first movement, America Before the War, is set entirely within the United States, and the specific samples of train whistles are of American trains, in contrast to the European train whistles heard in the European part of the piece later on. Now, unless you're a serious train whistle aficionado, this today can perhaps seem a little redundant. But the sound of a local train is one of those sounds that you don't realise how much you recognise and find nostalgic until you hear it outside of its natural habitat. And this is what it is for Reich, the sound of his childhood. The train whistle, doubled here in the violin, is playing a consonant F and A major third. Harmonious, pleasant. When the European train whistles are heard later on in the piece, the contrast between the familiar American ones and the piercing shriek of the European ones could not be more stark. Steve Reich called Different Trains the most autobiographical of his works, and the more relaxed train whistle of America is reflective of this. Different Trains is partially born out of a childhood trauma, since the train journeys themselves stemmed from the separation of his parents, but his circumstances were fundamentally fine. John Michael Pym described these trains as the transportation choice of rich and successful movie stars, and that, in an era before air travel became commonplace, these trains epitomise stylish, long-distance transportation. In fact, one meal in the restaurant car aboard the 20th Century Limited, the most famous of these Pullman trains, would cost a full 1% of the average professional American's yearly earnings. This, and being able to afford a full-time governess to accompany the young Reich, shows his childhood not as one of oppression and powerlessness, but one of relative luxury and comfort. The movement builds into the first chord change, through these ascending thirds in the violin and viola, before the first chord change comes. It comes alongside a dramatic key signature change, from 1 flat to 5 flats. The G flats and A flats, pulling the semitone down, hold a particularly melancholy feel. Though the chord has changed somewhat, it doesn't sound wildly different here, because the most prominent 3 notes, that being F, C and B flat, are still heard in very much the same way. The most instantly noticeable thing, rather, is the tempo change, speeding up to 108 beats per minute. These tempo changes occur every time the sample changes, allowing the strings to be in sync with the samples. This, along with the harmony changing, creates something of a disconnect between each different sample. It feels, to me, less like one cohesive story being told, and more like a bunch of vignettes tethered together at the edges, but only tenuously forming a whole. This isn't a criticism. In fact, I think it works to the benefit of the piece, since it structures the piece like a memory, little set pieces, fragments of conversation, sights, sounds and smells that form a narrative, but not always a crystal clear one. We hear a female voice repeating the phrase "from Chicago," or "from Chicago to New York." This is the voice of Virginia, Reich's childhood governess, in her 70s by the time that the interview was being recorded, a voice associated more than any other with the journeys by Reich himself. Musically, the time signature alternates between 2/4 and 3/8, cutting out 1 quaver every other bar.
From Chicago.
This gives a kind of uncertain skipping effect. Reich doesn't do this just to fit the sample in. He could still start the sample 1 quaver later, but it just stops it from sounding too certain. The full sample says from Chicago to New York, but much of the time it just says from Chicago. Which version of the sample Reich chooses isn't in any particularly structured way. The whole piece is minimalist, and the string rhythms are very predictable, so little things like this keep the piece from being too stagnant whilst not sacrificing that minimalist aesthetic. It's not just one unchanging monolith that only alters at sample changes. This has the same effect as that time signature thing. The only sample repeated within the first movement in more than one place is from Chicago to New York. It's over a quieter string part than previously, and it feels innocent.
From Chicago to New York.
If one stopped listening to the piece here, it would simply be a nice piece about trains across America, perhaps a piece about divorce at its darkest interpretation. It's the last moment of innocence, because it's followed by the most interesting moment of the first movement.
In 1939. In 1939.
Ostensibly, what they're talking about here is still innocent, just the train rides across America, but the music becomes a little more sinister here. In fact, one could be forgiven for mistaking the mention of 1939 as the beginning of the second movement, until you hear where it actually starts. The piece loses its innocence here. As though they're still talking about the same thing, the mentions of 1939 and 1941 have clear connotations. This is the approach of war. The more similar two samples are, the more different Reich tries to make the music underneath to retain this vignette-type approach. For example, before and after figure 53, the samples change from in 1939 to just 1939, meaning that to create the right amount of contrast, pretty much everything else changes.
In 1939.
1939.
The time signature goes to 5/4, and the C minor 7 add 11 moves to an A major 13 sound. If you look at the circle of fifths, which displays closely related key signatures next to each other, C minor and A major are polar opposites, as unrelated as you can get. At the start of the second movement, the piece goes into half time, with the paradiddle now happening in quavers rather than semiquavers. The beginning of the movement is extremely clear, with sirens wailing up and down, heralding the beginning of war.
1940. 1940.
The use of speech melodies here also enables for the different accents of the people to shine through. The voices in this part have distinctly a variety of different European accents.
1939.
And, as with the first movement, geographical locations are integral to the piece, mentioning Holland and Hungary instead of New York and Los Angeles. The voices here are sourced from a different place to those in the first movement. This movement, entitled Europe During the War, features interviews with 3 Holocaust survivors, Rachella, Paul and Rachel. Pulled from Yale's Fortunoff video archive rather than Reich's personal life, 3 testimonies were chosen to display the experience of European Jews during World War II. The first of these voices heard comes from Paul Davidovitz, a Czechoslovakian Jew who, alongside his mother, spent the war years moving from town to town, forging documents to constantly evade the Nazis. If I were to choose one moment from the whole piece I found the most impactful, it would be the moment that Paul describes the experience of his being singled out as Jewish by a teacher when he was in 2nd grade, recalling how the teacher referred to the Jews as black crows. The notes heard in the strings here are C sharp, G sharp, F sharp, D sharp and B. The vocals, on the other hand, sound out G natural, G sharp, A and C sharp. Working pretty independently, when combined with the harshness of the K and the downward movement on crows, this moment sounds out a real intensity, especially with the actual nature of the metaphor in the words being spoken.
Said black crows. Black crows said.
It's the most perfect marriage of sound, language and music in a piece that aims for it the whole way through. Wlodarski also notes how these plosive sounds work better with the lower pitched male voice, punching through more in the mix. The European train whistles, unlike the American ones heard earlier, shriek in wild dissonance.
Into the strength of my
Reich himself referred to them as short triadic shrieks, in contrast to the long-held perfect intervals of American ones. The 2 lines about cattle wagons are the only actual direct mentions of the trains to the concentration camps. The tritone whistle pairs well with this moment.
into the strength of my
The train whistles are brought in slowly. They sound almost reversed. They sound like screams.
lots of cattle wagons there.
Reich described the harmony in the second movement as both more chromatic and darker than the other 2. which makes sense, it is the war movement. After Paul finishes speaking, Rachel begins her testimony, but she's only afforded 2 lines, saying, "No more school, you must go away."
You must go away.
Wlodarski sees Rachel, therefore, as a transitional figure, switching between Paul's experience at school and Rachella's at the camps. Rachel's voice is pretty subdued and quiet, buried further down in the mix than the other samples. Her lines are quick, just little bursts of semiquavers. Unless you actually go out of your way to check that Rachel and Rachella are different people, it's not necessarily obvious. Though briefly heard at the start of the movement, the bulk of Rachella's testimony comes towards the end. Rachella, as the only one of the 3 who actually experienced the concentration camps, including Auschwitz, offers a description not just of anti-Semitism, but of the actual concentration camps. Musicologist Naomi Cumming has argued that the second movement receives a more detailed treatment of its narrative, in the sense that the words tell more of an actual narrative, less vignette-like than the first movement. Rachella's description, instead, is far more detailed on the experience of arriving at Auschwitz. The only word or phrase repeated by 2 different people across 2 different movements is 1940, said by the American Pullman Porter in the first movement and again by Rachella in the second. Listen to how different the same word sounds. The accent is different, the cadence is slower. The siren instead of the engine gives it a more ominous feeling, and it sounds sad instead of happy.
1940, 40, 1940.
1940. 1940.
Towards the end of the second movement, the paradiddle ends for the first time. Instead, one long held-out chord, a G minor 11, sounds out, with only one viola and sampled voice departing from this.
Flames going up in the sky. Flames.
And a little later on, the voices have disappeared altogether, and it's just one held-out note which fades into nothing. There's a reason that the paradiddle ends here. It stops alongside the train, pulling into Auschwitz. By the start of the third movement, after the war, the paradiddle has ended altogether. Rather than the unison rhythm being played by all the parts, lots of little short melodic fragments, independent of one another, are heard. There's far more space here than at any other point in the piece. The first minute or so of the final movement is more optimistic. It's almost like a musical equivalent of the immigrants stepping off the boat at Ellis Island into the bustling vibrancy of New York. Over this sense of optimism, Paul says, "And the war was over."
The war was over.
But this moment of optimism is stalked by one of the starkest changes in tone throughout the whole piece. The music goes into halftime, switches key, and the forward-pushing optimism ends. The change is accompanied by 3 unsettling words. Are you sure?
Are you sure?
Ostensibly, Rachella here is talking about the moment that the Danish Red Cross told the prisoners that they were free, and that it almost felt too good to be true. Yes, it's a statement of disbelief in its original context, but Reich's placement of it can be seen as a comment on the continuing nature of anti-Semitism in particular, and fascism and hate in general. This goes back to why Different Trains isn't documentary, but rather just art. Rachella's words here are being used to say something that she wasn't really saying, and that's fine. That's the beauty of what Reich has created. Different Trains would win Reich a Grammy Award for Best Classical Contemporary Composition 2 years after its composition, in 1990, and, in the words of Karina Venter, earned Reich's place amongst the great composers of the century. 2 of the survivors whose testimonies were included would even attend performances of Different Trains later in their lives. I first heard Different Trains 7 years ago in the Bilbao Fine Arts Museum, in a triptych video installation by Beatrice Caravaggio that set images of the Holocaust to the music. The room it was displayed in was big and black, except for one wall that made up the whole screen, and I instantly found the piece captivating and wanted to find out more, and in making this video, I have. Thanks for watching. I know this video delved into some pretty heavy stuff, but I hope you feel it was worth your time, and I encourage you to listen to more of Reich's music. I'd start with the desert music, personally. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then consider watching some of my other videos, leaving a like and subscribing, and best of all, leaving a comment, because I always love hearing what you have to say about the music I talk about. And hopefully I'll see you next time.